what we need of Muslims to tell the truth. If a person's going to hellfire, they're not going to like to hear it, but who likes to hear about going to hellfire anyway? It has to be told. And it has to be said that I heard someone warn me of this. And believe me, when they get warned of hellfire, it's completely different than being promised paradise. They'll say everybody's good, we're all promised paradise. But you tell them, you don't take this path, you're going to hellfire, it means a lot. Or it'll make them pay attention to what's being said. And there's examples of that. You can read all throughout the Qur'an. But one thing that you'll notice in the ayat is that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about pleasure, it's usually always coupled with pain. You'll see verses that speak about hellfire, and then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَبَشِّرِ الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ. If you read Surah An-Naba, if you actually pay attention to those ayat that speak about hellfire, it is so painful. It is so painful to read that and feel that any human being would go through something like this. And then you feel completely saddened and as if there's no escape. And then the verses will start speaking about hellfire. Will start speaking about Jannah. Because there is a way out. It's not that people are doomed. Because when the person says, are you saying I'm going to hellfire? Yes, we are, but there is a way out. And that way out is in following Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and that way out is into Jannah. But it has to be coupled together in order for both of them to have that effect. So using pain and pleasure. I'll give you this example, something that I do with youth if I'm dealing with them, younger kids, is that if I see a child playing a Game Boy, I will bring the other cool kids, and people might not agree with me on this technique, but I will actually get everybody to put that kind of activity down. You know, like, it's not cool to play Game Boy. And I would create an atmosphere amongst the kids. I would just provoke this kid and that kid. It's kind of bad, but to kind of make fun of the other kid, okay? That's not good, obviously, to make fun of people, but make an atmosphere where the child is embarrassed and it brings him pain to waste his time like this. And there were times like that in the Muslim Ummah, and now it's come where the child gets pleasure and everybody's smiling saying, oh, what game do you got on the Game Boy? Where there's more pleasure involved. What I try doing is make an atmosphere of pain to a child like this. So for example, we have a camp at the masjid, and then one or two kids doesn't come, and then he comes back and he's showing off that he stayed home because he wanted to watch TV. And I would almost create an atmosphere, and again, mocking isn't the way, but it's kind of like it, where someone who does that is a loser. And then the kids start creating this. They themselves create a pressure that no child can stand up to. That anybody who doesn't come to the activities in the masjid is the loser. Which is true. There are losers who don't get involved in the thing, but you have to create that atmosphere of pain attached to those actions that aren't beneficial to the people. How do you do it? There are many ways to do it, but I was just giving you an example. Pain and pleasure. Number 2, using analogies. Using analogies is a technique that you'll find all throughout the Qur'an and all throughout the Sunnah. An analogy is something where you compare something to something else. I'll give you this example, and you may have had this example done to you before, where a Christian will come up to you, and they'll take a piece of paper and say something like, this is a single piece of paper, right? And then they'll go, if I fold it like this, and then I fold it like that, I fold it into 3. I fold it into 3, but if I open it up, it's still 1. And they'll say, this is the analogy of the Trinity. How many people have heard something like that? Raise your hand. I just want to see how far their da'wah has gone. Right? Okay. Many of you heard, they have many analogies like that. Their whole thing is based on analogy. Analogy is a Qur'anic technique. And it's very significant because a Christian will do this to a Muslim, and the Muslim, their shoulders will slump, and they'll have nothing to say against this. One sheikh, he's from Syria, and he lives in Medina, and he used to teach us. And he said that the Christians came to his house, one Christian Arab guy came and he did this. And the sheikh, subhanAllah, this is just the power of the ulama. He said, give me that paper. And so the Christian gave it to him, and he said, look, you say if I fold it like this and I fold it like this. And he said, you tell me, what if I folded it like this? He folded it a 4th time. And he said, what if I fold it like this? And he folded it a 5th time. He said, what if I fold it like this? A 6th time. He said, it's shirk. You're just associating partners with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and you're just talking foolishness. He brought the analogy, the Christian had nothing to say. Okay, but that's the power of an analogy. And if you ever have an analogy used against you, it is a serious, it's a serious argument blow to you. You have to come back with your own analogy, or be the first person that sets up the analogy. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Qur'an about أَلَمْ تَرَ كَيْفَ ضَرَبَ اللَّهُ كَلِمَةً طَيِّبَةً كَشَجَرَةٍ طَيِّبَةٍ أَصْلُهَا ثَابِتٌ وَفَرْعُهَا فِي السَّمَاءِ. If you go into some Muslim countries and some guy gets on the microphone and says, "Kalima طَيِّبَةً," what do the people say in reply? La ilaha illallah, right? How do they know that? This is the analogy that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said. That the kalima tayyibah means the good word. Means the good word, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made an analogy between the good word and a tree. A tree that is firmly rooted in the ground. Asluha thabit wa far. It's firmly rooted in the ground and its branches reach out high up into the sky. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, and the analogy of kalimatin khabitha, which is kufr, is like a wretched tree. And I remember one teacher in our Islamic school, she took the students out and they were memorizing Qur'an, and she showed them a beautiful tree, and then they were memorizing the surah. Kalimatin tayyibah. That this is your iman. These trees. This is the analogy of your iman firmly rooted in the ground and its branches reaching out into the heavens. What I said there, that when people call out kalima tayyibah in some countries, it's become their culture because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that coined this analogy. The ahadith that talk about analogies are very well known hadith. I'll give you an example of a hadith that's well known, and that is the analogy of the Prophet ﷺ saying that if someone leaves their home and bathes themselves in this river that's outside 5 times a day, would they have any dirt left on them? And they said, La ya Rasulullah. And then the Prophet ﷺ said, this is the example of as-salawat al-khams, the 5 daily prayers, that it purifies a person like this, just like the water purifies someone. And you will see another example when the woman came to the Prophet ﷺ and she said, my mother made an oath that she would perform Hajj. And after she, and she passed away, should I perform Hajj for her? The Prophet ﷺ didn't say, yes, do it. He said, Ara'ayti. He said, do you see that had your mother had a worldly debt to pay, a financial debt, would you pay it on her behalf? And the woman said, yes. And the Prophet ﷺ said, فَدَيْنُ اللَّهِ أَحَقُّ بِالْقَضَاءِ. Then the debt owed to Allah is more worthy of being fulfilled. But he made the analogy to make the situation simple for her, okay? Using analogies. So when you're talking to someone that you're giving da'wah to, and if you're always talking about Islam to people, you should always have that analogy ready to give. What is your analogy of Tawheed? What is your analogy? There are many analogies. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala coins them in the Qur'an. You can go and find that. Such as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives the example of a slave that has 2 masters. Or you can say an employee that has 2 bosses. How can he go forward in his job? And there are other analogies like that. You can see them in the Qur'an. Technique number 3, using stories. Using stories. All throughout the Qur'an, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala places stories. You can find almost every second page, Allah Azza wa Jal is telling us a story. Whether it's the story of Musa, the story of Isa, alayhim as-salam. You have the stories of the people who had the gardens. You have the story of the 7 sleepers. You have the story of Abu Lahab. You have the story. You can keep going like that. The surahs. And anytime you see those surahs, they're most likely Meccan surahs also. They're very early in the da'wah that those stories were being used. So you see Surah Hud, Surah Yunus, Surah Ibrahim. These are all the stories that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala recites. And of course, you know Surah Yusuf. Surah Yusuf, all the children know the story. There's the story of the boy and the king, right? And they made a little cartoon video about it. I remember one imam, he gave a khutbah his entire khutbah was to tell the story in Arabic and translate it to English. And I felt really bad because I said to myself, there is not a single child in this entire masjid that doesn't know that story. And I saw that because it's a long story, all the children knew it. And they were like, they were getting bored because they knew it. And that's the power of a story. If had he said a surah, many people wouldn't know the surah in the Qur'an. But when it came to story, everybody knew the story. And that's the power of getting your message to continue to other people. The stories live on. there's certain benefits to this. Number one, that when you tell a story, the story is always remembered from the beginning to the end. So you could give a half an hour. If I gave you a half an hour story, and then you went upstairs and maybe your spouse or something, they asked you, what did he say? You could probably tell the whole story again. The whole story from the beginning to end, half an hour. You could tell it. And the story has that power for people to be able to grasp the whole thing inside the story. Number two, that there are different lessons to be extracted from stories. So it's not just, this is the lesson. And actually, I think that that's a mistake when people come to the end of the story and say the lesson or moral of the story is this. Because that minimizes their imagination. For example, if you tell a story of a father and a son relationship and how, maybe it broke down or they came back together, the parents in the audience will take lesson from the father's position in the story. The children in the audience will take lesson from the child